Dames en heren, goedemiddag.
Hoi hoi, hello and welcome to the Meet Maastricht podcast. I'm Katrina and together with our resident local Lucy, we will be exploring some of the amazing stories that make Maastricht so special. So sit back, relax and join us as we learn about our favourite Dutch city. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 11 of the Meet Maastricht podcast. How are you, Lucy?
Yeah, bravely soldiering on in all life's vagaries as everybody, I suppose. But it was another glorious day in the city, as I suppose you've all seen. And at the same time, we're all praying for rain because all the green brothers and sisters are thirsty. So I will be watering my balcony plants after this.
Yeah. What are we talking about today?
This was sort of an ill-considered announcement of mine last time when I said we were going to talk about the Minderbroedersberg, the mountain of the Lesser Friars, because I like to tell stories in chronological order, and now I can't, because this is the second church and convent of the Lesser Friars in Maastricht, and the Lesser Friars being the Franciscans.
Okay.
So they have been here for centuries, and altogether they have had 3 different churches plus convents here in the city. And the one we are going to talk about tonight is the second one.
Okay.
And I think people will know it as the building that is atop a slight rise, not actually a berg, meaning mountain, but a slight rise of the Tongense Street, which now houses the board and the administration of the University of Maastricht.
So why do you know why they're called the Lesser Brothers rather than just the Franciscan?
Over the centuries, many of these monastic orders would have names added to the original one because of the history. You know, stuff happens all the time, and there would also be the general populace would also give certain orders a particular nickname.
Yeah.
And the order of the Franciscans, of course, does have a Latin name, as they all do, and that is the Ordo Fratrum Minorum, so the Order of the Lesser Brothers. So if you see the name of an author with OFM behind at the end of the name, that means he's a Franciscan father or brother. There's 2 varieties there. The fathers are ordained priests, and the brothers are not. So that is the official name, the Lesser Friars.
Yeah.
But since they were founded by Francis of Assisi in the 12th century in the north of Italy, in Assisi, obviously, they are pretty much called Franciscans everywhere.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So there's official names and there's nicknames, and then in the course of the centuries that this order exists, there have been reform movements and other names would be added to these 2 original ones, and so there are many more names as well, and it gets very confusing. But the main thing to remember about the order of the Franciscans, and there is more of them that were founded in these Middle Ages, is that they were, and I think I've said this before, these were urban orders.
Okay.
So they were not the monks cultivating the land or building dikes and living in these huge abbeys that were, pretty much cities out in the countryside. These were urban orders, and they would take on services for a city population. And the Franciscans were really standing out amongst these by their communal vow of poverty. of course, when you join a monastic order, you have to take vows of chastity and of poverty and of obedience.
Yeah.
But you do that as a person. And the Franciscans were exceptional in the sense that they, as a community, also vowed to be as poor as possible.
Okay.
So they pretty much begged for their upkeep and provided for it themselves to the largest extent possible.
Yeah.
And of course, things being the way they are, or people being what they are, quite a few of these monasteries would still amass considerable wealth over time. And of course, then there would be a reform movement again saying, well, you've drifted away from the principles of our founder and we have to repent. We have to.
Yeah, I was going to say the building's quite big, so I assume that at some point that sort of has shifted along the way somewhere.
Yeah, but also the thing to remember here, and that is also this opulence to some extent is misleading, because what happened, at any rate, definitely for this particular convent, is these brothers put out a call for their colleagues, for other Franciscans in the Low Countries, to come and help them. And so there were a few dozen men camped out in the fields outside the first city wall, and they spent a summer making and baking the stones that the building was constructed from. And they had the woodworkers who could cut the beams for the roofs, but also had a gift for making beautiful paneling in the church and wooden statues and choir benches and stuff like that. They had one amongst them who made all the paintings. So they did a lot of the work themselves, and of course that is beautifully in keeping with an order and a collection of individuals who vow to be poor.
Yeah, I suppose modern sensibilities, we just take that for granted that they paid someone else to do it.
Yeah. And that would often be the case as well. But in this case, it was their own handiwork. They made the church and the convent. Yeah.
So when did the Franciscan brothers come to Maastricht then?
Pretty early. I'm casting about for the exact year here. The founder, Francesco Bernardone, lived from 1182 to 1226. So he was the founder.
Yeah.
And then it spread over Western Europe very quickly, and within 10 years it reached the Low Countries. And the first houses of Franciscans were founded in 5 towns at the same time in 1228, and they are all now in Belgium. Leuven, the university city, Diest. Oh no, 's-Hertogenbosch is Dutch. Now, of course, not then. Now, Brussels and Sint-Truiden, and it was something like 5 years later that they came to Maastricht.
Right.
And we talked about this when we discussed the Dinghuis. It was in the 13th century that Maastricht was beginning to be a proper city with all the functions and characteristics and organizations that are part of that, and so that fit right in.
Yeah.
The populace was building the wall. The city wall, as of 1229, and they were starting to write down the laws and the rules and regulations for the city, and the trades were being organized in guilds, and all these characteristics of medieval city life. And of course one of the characteristics would be beggar monks or poor monks.
Yeah. So when did the building that we know now, when was that constructed?
Much later.
Okay.
Because this is a story that I will go into in detail when we I'm sorry for messing up the chronology. That when we discussed the first Franciscan church, which now houses at RHCL, the original archive, that was built in the 13th century also, and it was doing very well. But at the same time, the 15th and 16th centuries have seen something like the Dutch Revolutionary War. That's not what we call it. We call it the 80 Years' War. But it is an uprising of the Low Countries against the overlord at the time, the King of Spain.
Okay.
And the Low Countries eventually split into a northern part, which became a republic over time and Protestant, and southern lands that remained under the rule of the Spanish king and Catholic. And with the fortunes of war, this has shifted back and forth for quite a long time. So Maastricht has been beleaguered and sacked and ransacked, looted several times. And in one of these conflagrations, a Franciscan friar was caught up, and as punishment, the entire order was expelled.
Okay.
Yeah, and then they went to St. Peter, because separate, not just a separate village outside the walls of Maastricht, but under a completely different overlord. So, they might be banned from Maastricht, but they were free to live in St. Peter. And they did for quite some time, until things calmed down again and they could return to Maastricht, and they were allowed back in towards the end of the 17th century.
Yeah, I think that's such a good example of how different things were, and how the separations were so different from now. Because, as I've said before on the podcast, I live in St. Peter, and I don't feel like I've been banished from Maastricht.
No, you're not. You've been annexed.
Yeah.
The old St. Petenaren still resent this. I got a sense of that when I lived there.
Okay.
About having been gobbled up by the city. That was just they because St. Peter is ancient and it always had been free. So they don't like this arrangement.
Okay.
But yeah, there you are.
So when the Franciscans returned to Maastricht, that's when the current building was built?
Yeah, well, that's of course at first this is 1673.
Yes.
That's where we are. Then the French king has conquered the city again. So this is the siege where D'Artagnan died, right?
Right. Okay.
Anyway, let's not go there. They came back to the city, and it was just a handful of men then at that time, and they had a look at the state of the church and the convent, and it was dilapidated, and it was in use by all sorts of other people and organizations, and it was a mess, really. And they weren't getting it back also, so they then appealed to the rulers of the city. Come on, this is not fair. We are supposed to have to get our church and convent back, and that is just not possible. It's also going to mean putting orphans out on the street because they're now housed in the convent. And then from the Dutch overlords, they were given permission to build a new building.
Okay.
So that's what they did, and that is also this is when they got people to their colleagues, sounds a bit weird, but their fellow brothers, about 50 of them from all over, and they started putting clay in molds and baking it in kilns constructed on the spot until they had enough stones to start building.
Yeah. So was that on the same spot then, or is that I assume they had to build somewhere else from the original church and convent. So the original ones were the archives? Is that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. So that is still standing.
Yeah.
So they were given a different spot outside the first city wall.
Yeah. I could keep track of things in my brain.
Yes, it is. It is. Of course, it is. always in these tales, you're talking about hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And about organizations that are there for decade after decade, and for buildings that are there for centuries on end. And of course, all sorts of stuff happens to them.
Yeah.
So yeah, it gets vague. So this church and convent of the Lesser Friars on the Minderbroedersberg was built towards the end of the 17th century, and then it was in use as a church and convent for this community for a good century, until, of course, forever, the great eraser of the French Revolution.
Yeah.
What is of particular note here is that they started on the church first. So I don't know. They must have been boarding somewhere else, or they must have just kind of lived in the church. I don't really know. But it was a little later only that they started on the convent. So the place where they were going to live, and where they would each one in their own little cell, and where the service rooms and buildings were, because like so many convents, they would provide for their own in many ways. So there was a room where the washing was done, and there was a brewery, and they had their own kitchen, and they had a large kitchen garden. Because this is something we've mentioned before too. Outside the first city wall, but inside the second city wall, for decades and decades, there was lots and lots of open space.
Yeah.
So all these convents would have grounds with the buildings as well, and the Franciscans also, being the type of order that they were, having to be self-sufficient and living simple lives, they had a large vegetable garden for their own food.
Okay, so I think we're gonna have a little break, and we'll be back in a couple of minutes to talk some more about the Minderbroedersberg.
Very good. Yes.
We are back from our little break. I think where we left off was the French Revolution was just happening, and things were changing for the Minderbroedersberg.
Almost. The plural is on the broeders, not on the minder. So it's the Minderbroedersberg. Yes.
Okay.
Very good. Yes, very good. Yes, as in most of these stories about these parts, it is always the French Revolution that sort of makes a clean break with everything that went before, and so the revolutionary French army stormed into Maastricht and surrounding area in 1794, and made Maastricht the capital of a new department. Department. That is, you could say that in English, couldn't you?
Yeah.
Of the Nedermaas, la Meuse inférieure. And then, of course, one of the most revolutionary things they did as the new lords of these regions was to close most of the churches and to abolish all the convents and the chapters, like Salvases and Our Sweet Ladies.
Yeah.
So in the fall of 1796, one of their functionaries came to the Lesser Friars and said, I am closing you down, and the state is confiscating all your possessions. And then the same day an inventory was taken. They didn't manage to do that with the library for a very particular reason, namely that it was one big unsorted heap, which is also a bit of a pity, because you do wonder about everything that must have been there,
Yeah.
But still, early in the spring of the next year, the last of the inhabitants of the convent, and that at the time that those were 33 fathers, so monks that had been ordained priests, 6 brothers, and 2 people that would simply be housed in the convent. They left the buildings, and they just have to find another roof over their heads and have to find another way to provide for their living expenses.
So did they move elsewhere once everything was sort of taken from them, or were they allowed to stay in the same place?
Well, no. As far as the material I have in front of me now doesn't describe where exactly they ended up, except as a community they were dispersed, and then each individual just had to find his own way in this new world.
Yeah.
I don't suppose they would have been left in total destitution, because when you read about how the city folk, the populace of Maastricht, how they reacted to these things that were happening to these communities, it's not as if they would be totally left to their own devices. And you can see that, because that, of course, this is always the same. This is traced in minute detail in the archives, not what happened with the people, but what happened with the stuff.
Yeah.
So all the possessions of the convent of value were those are traceable. We can know from the documents where they ended up, and then maybe a trail goes dead at a certain moment. But then a unifying theme there is that a general populace would help in all sorts of ways to collect these pieces of furniture, artworks, vestments, reliquaries, everything they could manage to save, they saved.
Yeah.
And they kept it, hoping for a change of fortunes, which of course came very, very quickly. All of this didn't last so very long.
No. Well, also, as we've spoken about before, it's not like they were just some separate random people. They were, they're doctors and they're teachers and, a proper, I imagine, a very vital part of the community. So
yes,
it must have been very hard to see that happen to people that they knew and had grown up with. Yeah,
and often relatives, of course, as well. So yeah. No, we know pretty exactly what happened with all the stuff from this convent of the Lesser Friars, and it went to private homes. It was bought by parish churches. So St. Matthew's, for instance, had gilded stars that had been on the ceiling of the Lesser Friar church.
Yeah.
And then when the church was put back to use, the stars were put back too.
Wow.
And of course, the most famous treasure that was carefully guarded from the possessions of the Lesser Friars was the statue of Our Sweet Lady.
Right.
That has been guarded and hidden and kept safe all through the centuries, and that it's the same statue we can still see in the chapel next to Our Sweet Lady's church. But that was originally, it was in the church of the Lesser Friars.
Wow.
In the first one, even. Yeah.
And so what happened, when were they allowed back? I imagine after French occupation. When were they allowed back into that space?
Well, they weren't.
No?
No, they weren't. The order was allowed to come back, but then, of course, the building had been put to other. Exactly the same thing has happened with the first one. They lost.
Yeah. Oh.
So in Dutch there is this. Yeah, they had left, and the building was put to another use. And when the order was allowed to come back, the building was still in use, and the people using the building didn't really want to vacate the building, so they built a third church and convent.
Oh dear.
Yeah, that no longer exists.
Do we know where it was?
Yeah. In a place that is now called the Patersbaan. So yeah, which is very clear. Of course, it says the Friars road, more or less. So that's where the third one was, and that is also besides the Tongersstraat. So more or less across from the archway which leads you onto the grounds of I don't know what that is called today, but the economic faculty, so the School of Business of the University of Maastricht.
Okay.
It has this stone archway entrance, and more or less across from that is another stone arch, and it leads up. Not a mountain, but the street leading up there behind that stone arch is the Patersbaan, and that is where the third Lesser Friar church and convent was. But I don't think anything of that remains.
Yeah. Well, because that's not too far from.
No, that's almost next door. Yeah. Yeah. That is almost next door. Yeah.
Yeah. So what happened with the second one then?
Okay, it got really weird. It got really weird because it had existed as a unit for 100 years. Church and convent.
Yeah.
Used by the same group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And after the French Revolution, it was used for 200 years separately.
Okay.
And then basically the convent was used as a prison, and the church was used as a court.
Okay. So I mean, separately but related.
Yeah. Those are related. Those are related functions, but it's not as if there was a lot of exchange because of course, the judicial branch and the prison. There is a link, but it's not as if the judges share meals with the convicts. That's not really what. So those buildings were used and administered and kept up and remodeled separately, and of course completely botched up over time because changing population, changing rules, changing ideas about hygiene and about what a penal system should be like, and the same of course for the judicial functions. Of course an awful lot changes over time, and the buildings had to try and keep up with all those changes, and a fixed motive in the entire history is we haven't got enough space, it is not up to date, we need more money, so there's nothing new under the sun. And the kind of accommodations that we have now in the 21st century are, of course, pretty glorious compared to some of the stuff people in those days had to put up with. But still, the refrains in the papers are in the paperwork that we still have in the archives is, of course, very comparable.
Yeah. So was this the main prison then at this stage?
Yeah.
For Maastricht?
Yeah.
What happened? It is obviously not a prison and a courthouse anymore.
No.
What are the stages from it being the court and the prison to the university?
That is the last chapter in this story.
Yeah.
What we're skipping now is the Great Fire of 1866.
Ah, yes.
And that started as something that looked like it was negligible.
Yeah.
There was some straw in the attic, but they didn't get enough water to it quickly enough. So
Yeah.
it wasn't just the convent that was badly damaged, but the church as well. And that really should have been avoided.
Yeah.
That would have been avoidable.
Mm.
And I don't think there was any loss of life or anything like that. But what the city did lose was thousands and thousands of archival documents. And the founder of the LGOG, the historian Pastoor Jos Haberts, he was just utterly disgusted, because they had been pleading for a better archive for all these documents, and now he was writing, we found scorched pieces of paper blown all the way out of the valley to the villages on the first ridge. Please, carried on the wind.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's sort of reminiscent of, was it a couple of years ago in Brazil, I think, where a fire just destroyed the museum there. So that's still something that I think is quite topical and a problem for big old buildings that are housing a mishmash of all kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we keep trying, of course. The first church of the Lesser Friars now has, I think, 3 floors of concrete cellars.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yes, where the archives we still managed to keep into the 21st century are kept pretty safely.
Yeah, I think Maastricht's learned its lesson, at least.
One tries, but this was bad.
Yeah,
this was bad, and it's. But what's gone is gone, and then that was just it. And it was everything was sort of repaired, but not really restored very well. And and then there was the First World War and the Second World War, and it's not as if people's minds were focused on how do we optimally design and restore these ancient buildings. And then after the Second World War, it still took quite a long time to actually start moving. But that happened when the hospital of Maastricht, the main hospital of Maastricht, which was then housed in a large building called Sint Annadal, and that is at the end of the Annalaan. When that moved to the new University Hospital, and then that building, the former hospital, became the courthouse, which it still is today. But anyway, that when that became the courthouse, of course they could finally, and this was in the middle of the 90s, so 1995 more or less.
Yeah.
And then of course the old complex in the city, it was just so completely dilapidated and unrecognizable, and it had been remodeled and refurbished, and it was one big maze of uneven floors in the different buildings, and of narrow hallways, stairways, and one big maze. And so what the architects did as of 1995, which is when the university bought the building, and this has been the saving grace of many a monument in Maastricht's historic center.
Yeah.
The university stepping in, and they wanted more or less the spatial dimensions of the original building brought back. So that was more or less the main job for the architects, and they did that. So when you walk into the former church now, get a sense again in this space of a church.
Wow.
Of course, that is not the case when you just look at the building, because the front was replaced much earlier, because for a court they didn't think it should have a church front, so it has a court front now. There even used to be a statue there of Lady Justice,
Oh.
But that is no. But you can see where it must have stood in the way the front of the building is divided up. But it is no longer there, since it is
I was going
the
to say
university
that,
headquarters. Yeah.
It definitely doesn't look churchy. If
No.
if you're on the hunt for the old church, it could easily pass you by compared to a lot of the other buildings, which do look quite church-like. but obviously that's why that they've courtified it.
They courtified it. Yes, it's a beautiful choice of words, Katrina. Yes, but if you walk inside, which you can do quite often, of course, it is the administration building of the university, but there's also a hall there where lectures of Studium Generale and where promotions and other public events take place. So you can walk into it, and the space feels church-like because of the pillars and because of the arching ceilings. So there is still a whiff of church in there.
Yeah, a whiff.
Yeah. A whiff.
I think the tall ceilings as well. I think it gives it an air of a whiff.
But as I said, the lecture hall is used for public functions as well, so it's you can go there.
Yeah.
And Studium Generale will have interesting speakers. Almost never on anything in the humanities, which is weird, but they will have on all kinds of other subjects as well, and that will also at times include European studies and general international politics and stuff like that. So it is depending on your preferences, of course, but it is very often a very interesting program. Of course, right at the moment, none of that is valid, but yeah.
And is that usually in English or in Dutch?
It varies.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it is often in English. Yes.
Well, thank you for listening to the podcast. I just wanted to remind you all that we have a lot of photographs and a little extra information on the website as well. We have a web page for each episode of the history portion of the podcast, not for the Ask a Local segments. And if you want to, you can also watch the YouTube video, which is the same audio as the normal podcast with a little bit of a slideshow of some relevant photos, which is quite fun to watch. What do you know? Or is it a surprise what we're going to be talking about next week, Lucy?
No, I did give it a moment's thought this time. I thought I would go on with another now university building, which has a long history serving other purposes, albeit not so many as the former convent we just talked about, and that is the Hof van Tilly. So the court of Tilly, and that is now it now houses FASOS. So the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the top of the Grote Gracht.
Yeah.
So that for the next time.
Yeah. Well, we will look forward to it. Thank you for listening, and we will talk to you later this week about another Ask a Local question. In the meantime, stay safe and stay sane and look after yourselves. Thank you so much for joining us today, and don't forget to follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook by searching Meet Maastricht and on Instagram at @meet_Maastricht. If you would like to learn more about us, you can also visit our website at meetmaastricht.eu, where you can buy tickets and subscribe to our monthly newsletter so you're always up to date. Thanks again, and tune in next time to learn more about our beautiful city.
Tot ziens.